the themes that constantly comes up when I'm talking to other developers who are working on a product or thinking about building a product is this concept of speed. And this kind of runs the gamut of things. It's not necessarily one particular area that developers want to go fast in. It could be feature development, or it could be like the whole product itself. So like just getting the whole product done as quickly as possible. And personally, this doesn't really align with what I like to believe is a good process for building a product. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. So my personal view of this stuff is, if you're going to build a product, because it's such a monumental undertaking, and that's financially, mentally, emotionally, everything involved, because that's so monumental, I believe in focusing on the long term and not getting too caught up in short-term results or trying to churn something out as fast as possible. But I do recognize that there are certain situations and certain types of products that call for speed. So if it doesn't come out quickly, then it's actually going to work against what that product is trying to achieve, or the position it's trying to put itself in inside of the market. And so what I want to talk about in this episode is some of the things that I've identified as, okay, these are guaranteed to make you go faster. So if your goal is truly speed, and speed is a necessity, and I want to underscore that. So you've identified that for whatever reason, for whatever product you're building, for whatever market you're going after, for whatever type of customer you're going after, speed is absolutely essential. If you've identified that, I think that there are definitely some things that you can do to, at the very least, encourage that speed to be a part of your process. If not, make it like the centerpiece of what you're doing. So one of the words that came up in the last few years is this idea of the MVP, or the minimum viable product. And I think in the kind of and this is a natural process. This occurs outside of software development and startups and all that stuff. I think this happens with everything, which is the concept of an MVP, or the point of what an MVP is, got kind of telephoned to death, meaning like one person explained it to one person, and then they explained it to somebody, and then over time the quality of the message deteriorated to the point where what an MVP is, or what an MVP should be, kind of got deteriorated. So if you're not familiar with the term, an MVP, or again, it's a minimum viable product, is a product that tries to simplify what it's doing to the point where the hypothesis that's underlying the product can be tested as quickly as possible and as cheaply as possible. So the whole idea with an MVP, it is speed, but it's also trying to minimize risk. So like I said a few minutes ago, building a product is this monumental undertaking. And so if you're not certain that what you're trying to build, or what you're thinking about building, is going to succeed, you want to minimize the amount of risk that you're going to have to take on to get that product built. And so what an MVP suggests is, well, if you cut down what it is that you're focusing on, and you cut down what it is that you're spending time and money on, you can ship a product much faster without incurring all of that risk, or as much risk as you might if you took the traditional approach where you say, okay, I'm committing to this idea and I'm going to invest 6 months into development, a year into development, or longer. And so the kind of the core idea behind an MVP, or what it's putting an emphasis on, is reducing the number of features that your first version includes. So if you have this entire 5-year vision for a product, basically you force yourself to say, okay, I'm only going to focus on a little bit of this, or I'm only going to focus on what I think I can achieve as quickly as possible. So like in the next few weeks or in the next few months. There's also an emphasis on keeping the implementation of specific features simple, or the word that comes up is lean. So this idea, the MVP, or the minimum viable product, was introduced in a book called The Lean Startup that was released in 2011. And so you'll hear that word lean referenced quite a bit. So the idea here is keeping the implementation, or how you build the features in your product or how you build the product as a whole really simple or really lean. And then the third is avoiding any overcommitment to a specific path, meaning you're not going to get upset emotionally or kind of develop this cognitive dissonance if the idea that you set out to build ends up being the wrong one. Meaning, if you build something really quickly and you go to test it against customers and then they disagree with it or they don't find it as valuable as you thought they would, then you don't get upset. You just have a mental framework to say, okay, I'm going to shift over to this position. So those are kind of the three core things. So reducing the number of features, keeping your implementation simple, and avoiding overcommitment to a specific path. And the reality is that this is kind of painful. It's not easy to do this. And I say this phrase a lot, but it's kind of like like one of those little nuggets of wisdom or truth that I think you should apply to everything that you're doing. But specifically here, this idea of simple but not easy. And so because it's so painful, it's one of those things that affects, especially if you're kind of the entrepreneurial developer where you have a lot of ideas and you'd consider yourself like a creative type, this can kind of hurt you. And it can feel like you're limiting yourself. But again, I want to bring the point back to at least this episode, which is if you're trying to go fast, you kind of have to adopt a process like this. There's no way to build something at a super high level very quickly. Things that are like really polished and are kind of where you see a lot of products when they get to like the 3-year, 5-year, or even 10-year mark, where things are really dialed in and they really understand what they're doing. That's not something that you can just magically achieve quickly. You have to take time to get there because you have to learn. And that's ultimately the truth with pretty much any product, unless you're doing like a clone or a reimagining of an existing product. You're going to have to think through things, and you're going to have to go through the kind of the ups and downs of solving those problems and learning how to create a product that is that polished. So if you've never done this before, one of the best places you can start is to limit what it is you're going to work on. So this is kind of number one in that list, the whole idea of limiting the scope of what it is you're working on. And I found that the rule of 3 is best here. So again, say you have in your head, you're like, oh man, I've got ideas for this and that. And you know, it's enough stuff that it like, okay, realistically, this is going to take you 5 to 10 years to actually execute on. What's best is trying to figure out, okay, in that group of things, what are 3 that are absolutely important? Meaning, when you consider the customer that you're trying to solve these problems for, what are the 3 problems that are going to affect them most? Or another way to say that is, what solutions are going to deliver the most value back to that person? So you want to figure out, okay, even though I'm super hyped about these 10 things, what 3 are actually going to best serve the customer? Because again, if your goal is speed, what you're trying to do is prove your point as quickly as possible. You're not trying to say like, oh, well, I'm going to work on this stuff that I want to work on. And then, you know, if people are into it, great. If they're not, whatever. No, your goal is to go as fast as possible. So you really got to consider and ask like, who is this for? And really think about like, what are their pain points? And then use that information to scope down what it is you're going to build for this MVP or this first version. And one of the things, and I teach this to mentees at Clever Beagle all the time, which is just because you're saying no to stuff now doesn't mean that you can't say yes later. And this is super, super important to understand, because if your product idea catches on and people like it, you're going to, and we'll just kind of wrap that up in the colloquial success, right? So if you're successful, you're going to have all the opportunities in the world to go and try those other things. So really it just comes down to discipline and patience. You got to say, okay, I really, really, really want to do these things, but I'm not going to do them because I'm focusing on this. I'm going to focus on these 3 things and move as fast as possible right now. if that's your goal. Again, I have to keep restating here that these sorts of things should only come into your thinking if speed is your goal. Or, well, I guess I won't say only. So they should be a priority in your mind if speed is a goal. If speed isn't as much as a goal, you can kind of consider these things, but don't necessarily anchor all of your thoughts and your decision making to these things, if that makes sense. So again, get yourself down to 3 features and only commit to those 3 features. Don't waffle on it. You got to say like, okay, this is what we're doing, make the definitive decision, and just go and execute and build those 3 things. And then, and again, this is kind of the point of the MVP is you're admitting that you don't know. You're not certain of what it is that you're building or whether or not you're actually solving a problem. And so what you're saying by picking out the 3 is, okay, this is the course we're going to take, and these are the 3 ideas that we're going to test. These are the 3 hypotheses that we're going to test. And so if you can do that, and just naturally by scoping down your list, you're going to be able to move faster. It's inevitable. But if you waffle and say like, oh, well, I got to do these 10 things, and if the product doesn't have these 10 things, then people aren't going to like it, you're going to struggle to move fast. You're going to just get into a trap. One of the parts where I personally struggled with this whole idea, and this kind of plays into limiting things, not necessarily features, but the work that you're doing, is this idea of the custom user interface. And especially if you're a creative type of person, this is incredibly seductive, incredibly alluring, and it is the biggest pile of quicksand that you will ever find, especially when you're trying to ship a product for the very first time or you're trying to do it quickly. And so I guess this requires a bit of a story. So when I first started trying to build products, so I didn't really try and make an attempt at building a product until I was probably 3 or 5 years into software development as a whole. So early on, I just did kind of the HTML, CSS, and like maybe a sprinkle of JavaScript, but I didn't really know how to do what it is I do today. And so early on, my emphasis when I was working on something was always the design. It was always how it looks, how it's animated, how it's kind of pieced together in terms of the layout and the structure. That was kind of my domain, and so that's what I latched onto. And so back in, this would have been 2013, I had just moved to Chicago about a year earlier, and it was like kind of in the thick of the whole startup craze. Like people were losing their minds. They're like, I got to go get investment money. Like everybody, like, and their grandma had like a pitch deck. They're just like, I gotta go get some investment money. I'm going to build this thing and I'm going to build this thing. And there were like all of these, in retrospect, to just be fair, they were delusions of grandeur. But also to be fair, it was kind of fun. Like it was really exciting, and it was just a good, positive time. And so naturally, just like a lot of other people, I was like, well, yeah, I have a product idea. And the product idea that I had was I was doing a lot of freelance work. That was my primary source of income. And one of the things that constantly slowed me down was I was having to, for each new client that I would onboard or each new project that I would onboard, I would have to generate a contract for them, an invoice, and I would also do timelines. So I kind of set out an estimate of what I think it's going to look like for throughout the course of this project. Like this is where we're going to hit target. So basically milestones. And so in that process, I realized this is too time consuming. Like it would take me a minimum of an hour or more to set all of those pieces up. And I was like, wow, I feel like you could automate a lot of this. I feel like there's a lot of repetitive pieces here. And so getting caught up in the craze of everything and just wanting to learn how to build a piece of software, I decided like, I'm going to turn that into a product. And on the surface, I got to say, like, go back in time and give myself a pat on the back. Like, yeah, that's a good idea. But the number one place I screwed up, and I look back on this and I'm like, kid, that was really dumb, was I overinvested in the user interface. So again, that was kind of my domain at the time. Like I understood really well like HTML and CSS, and that's how I made my money. Like a lot of my design projects were at the time doing like website design and just general user interface design, but not actually wiring it up to a backend or anything like that. And so that's where I was super committed. And so I'll never forget this conversation. A buddy of mine who was, at the time, he was also in the early phases of building his own startup. And he was actually one of my clients. That's how we met. And he also lived in Chicago. We went out and got coffee just to kind of work together and get some stuff done during the day, not be lonely. And he was asking me, he's like, "So where's your app idea at?" And this is probably, I want to say maybe 2 to 3 months in, if not a little bit further than that. And I said, "Oh, well, I'm getting it done, but I'm really focused on," and I want to say at the time I was working on this like unnecessarily fancy tab interface, like tabs that you could click on and they'd animate or something like that. Something that didn't really have any impact on the value that I was delivering. And I'll never forget this. And I look back on it now and I was like, yep, he was right. And he just asked me, "Why don't you just use Bootstrap?" And it's one of those things where it haunts you in your dreams. It's like, why don't you just use Bootstrap, strap? And now that I look back, I'm like, yep, that was 100% the right choice. And the reason it was the right choice is that once I finally got to the point where I shipped that product, by the time I was done, because I was just churning so much on that one part of it, I was exhausted. I was absolutely burned out. And it was the first time I'd ever done it, so I didn't really have any expectation or framework for like how to process all this stuff. It was like, holy crap, that was a lot of work. Like I'd never done that much work on one idea before. And I realize now in retrospect that I could have reduced that work significantly and shipped something a lot faster. So I think it was probably about 4 to 6 months that it took me to get that initial version out, and that completely burned me out in the process. And so what I learned, and bringing this back to our conversation about speed, what I ultimately learned from that is go heavy on the user experience, but light on the user interface. So what I mean by that is when it comes to the user interface, especially if you're just trying to get something out the door quickly, just rely on CSS frameworks. So something like Bootstrap or Material UI, or there's Ant Design, or there's tons of these things out there. I even have fantasies of building my own. There's a warning to the wise. So the point is, pick out something that's already done for you. The thinking's done. So just use pre-made interface components. Don't try and invent your own UI or build something fancy and wavy and wishy-washy and all this stuff. And the reason why is that stuff is just inevitably going to slow you down. It feels valuable because you as a creative person are excited by it, but that doesn't necessarily translate to value for the customers unless the thing that you're building is like a design tool or something like that. Then maybe I could see an argument for okay, you have to have certain things. But generally speaking, for most people, that doesn't really play into anything, or doesn't need to play into anything. So if you're trying to ship fast, cut it down. Just focus on, okay, how does this thing work? How does it, and when I say how does it work, how is it organized? If you think about the way you've pieced together the organization of the steps that a user has to follow to extract value, like the onboarding process, or limiting the number of clicks that it takes you to fill out a form or to get access to some feature. Focus on those sorts of things and not, well, I have to have this crazy animation and all this stuff. Again, if speed isn't really a concern, there's some more room for that stuff. There's some wiggle room, because it's well, if you're really not concerned about speed and it's not a priority, you can spend a little more time on that stuff. But if speed is your goal, fancy UIs with crazy widgets and all this stuff that you don't really need and doesn't really add value, but you can convince yourself adds value, those are the things to cut out, because they just always add time to the project. And it's those things that you look at it at the outset and you're like, oh yeah, this will be easy. That'll take me no time. And the next thing you know, you've wasted 3 weeks trying to wire up some fancy widget that you didn't really need. And so keep that in mind. That's probably, at least in my experience, one of the areas that I see a lot of people struggle with is getting too overly committed to the UI as opposed to focusing on the UX or the user experience. And playing into all of this is one of my golden rules, and I've brought this up the past few episodes, and I've been talking about this for years, and Usually I get picked on for this, but I'm standing by it. I think this is right. This seems like the truth in my mind, which is to just use what you know. So one of the other big pitfalls that I see developers making and teams making, and I've made this myself, is thinking that, okay, I'm going to build a product and simultaneously build it with brand new technology I've never used before. So I've never seen this stuff in my life. I have no real experience with it. Maybe I look at it and I understand the syntax a little bit, but I have no frame of reference for like the nuances involved in how it works or where there might be pitfalls that I'm not expecting. And so if you're trying to move fast, absolutely avoid new stuff like the plague. You got to focus on what do you already know. Because if you think about it, it's like, well, say we'll take this back to like a real world example. So outside of software, say you're a baker and you're really good at making cakes and pastries and all this stuff. And like you make some of the best pastries in the world. But then I come to you, we'll say I'm a restaurateur and I'm gonna open a brand new seafood restaurant. And I come to you and I ask you to be the head chef. How good do you think your seafood's gonna be? Might not be bad, but because you're focused and because the thing that you know and you've practiced extremely well and for a long time is baking, you're probably gonna struggle a little bit. Few of the dishes aren't gonna be great. And so it means that, well, the quality of that product or the quality of the food at that restaurant is going to lack the potential that it could have for something really great. Same exact kind of line of thought applies to your product. So if you know how to use a given framework or a given library or a given set of tools extremely well, and when you sit down with them, you just knock stuff out. It's almost like you don't think about it. You see the connections in your head and you just say, do this, then do this, then do this, then do this, and done. If there's something like that you're relying on and you have that in your tool set, use that. Because that means that you're inevitably going to move quickly. And this requires a little bit of separation of thought as well as separation of what your goals are. So if your goal is to ship a product as fast as possible, you don't want a simultaneous goal of learning new things. Those are two independent goals. Yes, you can kind of get the whole two birds with one stone thing by saying like, oh, well, I'm going to learn this new thing while I build this. You can do that, but you got to realize it's going to slow you down. And I do unfortunately see a lot of developers who want to go fast. They have that as a goal, but then they also want to learn this new thing that just came out. And they get into this trap of, oh, crap, I'm starting development and it's taking me longer than expected. And now my product is delayed. And yeah, I'm kind of learning this new thing, but nothing's really going out the door. And it's because you're getting through that kind of beginner struggle of learning how a thing works. And so if you're going to try and build something fast, that doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't really add up that you'd be like, oh, well, I'm going to add this extra burden or tie this extra stone to my waist while I walk up this mountain. Because again, building a product, whether you're trying to go fast, whether your feature set is scoped down to just a few things, it doesn't matter. It's still hard. And so adding any weight to your back whatsoever is just going to make it take longer and it's going to stress you out more, especially if you have kind of a mental expectation that, okay, I'm trying to move fast. I want this done as soon as possible. So really, really consider like, are the tools that you're using, one, the best for the job, and two, the things that you're most efficient with? And if the answer to that question is no, reconsider. And realize, I said this earlier, so I talked about when it comes to features, this idea of just because you say no right now doesn't mean you can't say yes later. Same exact thing applies to technology. And when you do this, you'll actually learn something interesting about all this technology stuff, which is pay very close attention to trends and the speed and frequency at which those trends kind of turn over or roll over. And so what I mean by this is, say you just want to use, Handlebars was a really popular templating UI kind of framework library a few years back. So say you understand that extremely well and you just want to build with that so you can get something out the door. Pay attention to the things that you're choosing not to experiment with. So I'm kind of backdating this because this is something that is fresh enough in my memory. So I remember React came out, and everybody's like, you got to start building with React. You got to build with React. And I did this. I made this mistake on some client projects, which cost me at the time, which was I really understood handlebars. Like I knew it inside and out. I could just build stuff super quick. But I got caught up in the newness craze, and I was like, oh, well, I got to go build this with React. I didn't understand React. I had no framework for React. And so inevitably, I started on this new project, and I started building with React, and it just took me longer than it took me. And based on and the way that I had built out the project for the client was I said, oh, well, it's going to take me this amount of time. That amount of time was fixed on me using the tool set that I already knew. But because I introduced this new thing, it started taking longer and longer. And then I got to a point where I was overwhelmed and stressed out, and I said, I can't work on this anymore. And so what I've learned over the past few years is realize that there's always another train coming, or there's always another bus coming. So if your goal is to ship a product and then work on that product and earn a living from that product, use what you know now. And then if there's some technology that maybe you miss out on, fine. Realize that like it's just the nature of the beast with technology that there will always be new things to learn. But if your goal is to get something built that you can earn money from, or use as like the centerpiece of a portfolio if you want to go get a job, that has to exist. You can know all the new technology in the world, but if you can't produce a tangible result with it, then it's going to hamper your ability to get the results that you want, ultimately. So use what you know if you want to go fast. That's about it. And kind of wrapping this up, the hopefully this is clear, but the overarching theme here is that speed ultimately comes from simplicity. So if speed is your goal, simplicity is your friend, always. You know, trying to build a bunch of features all at once or make like this really fancy UI, all of those things are a recipe for slowness. There's no way around it. I've tried. I've had as much hubris as anybody, if not more. And every time it burns me where I'm like, no. I can make this really fancy thing and I can do it really quickly. Every time. Takes longer than I expected. I don't meet my goals, and I hamper my kind of my mental state and my motivation because I have this expectation of going fast. But in reality, I end up going slow because I've introduced all this stuff that I didn't need to. So realize that going fast is predicated on simplicity. There's no way around that. And I should say, so I don't confuse anybody, there's nothing wrong with going slow. And again, like I said at the beginning of this, that's kind of my personal view of things. And that's a view that's evolved over time. So again, my initial thought process was, oh, well, you have to do this as fast as possible. Couldn't tell you why, but I believe that. I really believe that like you have to go as fast as possible. But over time, as I've learned more and I've experienced like failures with building products that didn't see the light of day, or, you know, working with people on stuff that struggled to get out the door, what I've realized is that just kind of setting that expectation of slowness up front is great. There's nothing wrong with that. And so if you're kind of on the fence and you're like, oh, well, should I build it fast or should I build it slow? Consider building it slow. I can tell you now, the product that I've been working on for, goodness, coming up on probably about a year now, I've just been piecemealing it as I go. I set the expectation of no deadline. And this is the first time I've really tried this. Usually I have like a fixed date in mind, but now I'm just saying focus on quality of product and focus on delivering something that's extremely valuable to others. And I found that at the very least, my state of mind has been incredibly peaceful. Where I used to get really stressed out and really anxious, and I'm sure some of you listening and watching this have had this feeling of you set this crazy expectation on yourself, knowing full well that you can't meet it, and you still try and push toward it, kind of like just like a stubborn. I have this image in my head for some reason, like a porcupine. Like you're just like, I'm gonna push forward no matter what, really stubbornly. even though you know that you're not going to make it, you still do it, and you repeat this process, and every time you do it, you kind of whittle away at your self-confidence and your motivation and your overall your momentum. And I just think that, like, if you're on the fence about this stuff, really consider just chilling out, taking it slow, and then finding other things to supplement on the side. So basically, if the reason you want to go fast is so that you can produce something that's going to produce money for you, realize that realistically that's not going to happen, and instead say, okay, I'm just going to build this slow, and I'm going to do other work that I can to earn money on the side while I build this up, and just enjoy the process and enjoy taking my time. But if I do really want to go fast, make it easy on myself by saying, okay, let's simplify everything as much as possible, take the path of least resistance, and go as quickly as possible as a result, because I'm not introducing a bunch of stuff that I don't need. So I think that's going to do it for this week, folks. Really appreciate you watching. If you haven't already, make sure to head over to youtube.com/Clever Beagle. We've got the Eye for Detail episodes right toward the top. Make sure to subscribe, like these things, and hit the bell to get notifications, all that jazz. Like, smash the like button. Let me know that you like these, because it really helps me to know whether or not I'm delivering value back to you. Like, is this stuff that you didn't understand, or something that you didn't know, or you were a little nervous about? Definitely let me know that this is valuable to you, because that helps me know where I should take this information, because ultimately I want to make sure that you're comfortable and confident shipping a product. It's extremely hard, and it's extremely difficult, and I know that it can take a toll on you. So whatever I can do to help you reduce that anxiety and reduce that stress, definitely let me know. I'd really appreciate it. So that's going to wrap it up here, folks. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week.